So today I'm going to talk about detailing in Vectorworks. It's a topic that I had, I think we had done this a couple of years ago at one of our user group meetings, and it was something I was going to present about at the Vectorworks Design Summit, which was, of course, canceled this year. So I thought, well, since I've got all this preparation done, may as well go with it. There's a lot to go through in a relatively short period of time, so hopefully we'll be able to get to it all. And let's get started. So there's a couple of ways in which you can think about detailing in Vectorworks. Really two main methodologies, if you will. One is to create a highly detailed three-dimensional model, whether it's a full-on building information model or a singular component that's just modeled free-form, and then derive your detail from the 3D model. And then the other methodology, of course, is the tried and true, just drafting details as two-dimensional standalone drawings, irrespective of the drawing. And it's not that there's a right way or the wrong way, they both have their places. So I'm going to try to touch on some things to think about for both of those. First of all, I'm assuming that everybody can see my screen okay, and I can see some of you on video, you're nodding, so that's a good sign. Okay, great. Fantastic. And then, by the way, this is being recorded. I just want to make that clear. I'd mentioned that in the mail out, but in the rush to get here, you may not have noticed that. And the reason for that is that some of this might get turned into some content to share with other users not in the group. So that's kind of why I'm doing that. You know, if we're going to do this stuff, may as well share it with as many people as possible. So what you're seeing on screen is a viewport, and in fact, let's go ahead and click on that, and then I'll pull open the object info palette. There you go. So you can see that this is a section viewport of a model, and in fact, I'm going to be pretty bold here and go ahead and section this in place, which could be take a moment to do, but be able to see that. So here is the section that is being taken of the 3D model. And you can see that this is a hidden line rendering, and there are a variety of surface hatches and textures and so forth that are being included in that model. Oh, hey, Neil Barman's here. Hey, Neil, how are you? Good to see you. Let's see, you know, the pandemic's not all bad. You get to see people from across the country that you don't always get to see. So
exactly.
You know, gotta look for those silver linings. Anyway, so here's the 3D model of this project, and you can see that there's lots of components here. So let me go back to the viewport. And so if I zoom in closely here, you'll see that there's in this wall section, for example, there's chipboard, there's an insulated component, there's an insulated sheathing, and there's some siding, right? So all of these things are actually directly taken from the model, and so there's a fair amount of detail that you can generate from your three-dimensional BIM model. So here's another example. This is a great little case. We have a situation in this condition of the model where we want to have this window flush out with the ceiling and have a sort of a no header, no visible header kind of condition. Well, as you can see, look, there's just not a lot of structural depth here to get that working. And so thanks to the model, we were able to work out that we needed to have a little piece of steel tubing as a header to make all of that work structurally. I mean, it's not a huge span. I think it's like a 24 or 30-inch wide window, so it's not a huge header. But that's actually sort of built into the model. Now, if you look at the door over here, right, you'll see that here we've got a model through the door, and it's pretty simplistic, right? It's just a section of the model. And so if I zoom out, you can see that this detail is drawn at 1/2 inch equals a foot, which is to say that when it's printed, it's at 1/2 inch equals a foot. Obviously, everything is at 1-to-1 scale. And so even though we can have some components here that are fairly explicit with wall slabs and or wall stiles and roof slabs and so forth, at a certain point, the model just isn't detailed enough to be able to present like a 3-inch detail, right? And so this is why we have some viewports of details as part of this. So let's go ahead and look and see how that works. So if I double click on the viewport and I go into the annotations, you can see that I've got notes. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and pull back the curtain here. Let me go ahead and do a Command-6 so you can see everything. And I'm going to go ahead and select all and delete. Okay, so by doing that, you get to see how much of this drawing is actually generated automatically from the Vectorworks model, and how much of it has been annotated by, the office, and to be able to derive, to show you this kind of drawing. And really, there's a fair amount here that's directly taken from the model. So I don't want to leave the impression that because we supplement the model with some two-dimensional drawing in the form of our detailing, that sort of gives us license or encouragement to, not bother with any of these components in the model because you're going to draw it anyway. Because conditions like this start to become really explicit when the more that you model. So if only as a design process, I think it's a good practice to build your model as explicitly as possible without going over the top, right? So one of the reasons that we don't have super detailed windows and doors is because, you only need to draw a window detail in a couple of instances, head detail, jamb detail, sill, and so forth. But if you've got 50 windows in the model, now you're carrying 50 windows with a super high level of detail just for the sake of generating 1 or 3 details out of that. So in terms of computational efficiency, it makes sense to sort of not expect your model to be detailed at, say, 3 inches equals a foot, or in BIM parlance like LOD 500. We're not going to go ahead and put in every piece of flashing in the BIM model because you're only going to see it a few times, and you can do that in the two-dimensional drawing. So what's really important here, or one of the many things that's important here, so I've got all my notes and my annotations here, but do you see these little detail markers here? So these are really quite nice. Started using them a couple of years ago. Let's look at that in the object info palette and go ahead and pin it in place. So this is a detail callout marker, and this is not a detail viewport. It's a callout marker. You get it from I got to move the participants window here. You get it from your where are you? There we go. You get it from your dims and notes palette. Looks like that, right? And you can see that there's this green little link icon here. Now that does not print. It's just displayed on screen to let you know that this detail callout marker is linked to a specific viewport. In this case, there's a pull-down menu here, and all the viewports in my file are listed. And this is why you shouldn't, one of the many reasons why you shouldn't number your viewports, viewport 1, viewport 2, viewport 3, viewport 4, and so forth. Right. So the convention that we have is we number the drawing number, the sheet number, and then we have a description of the viewport itself. So viewport 3 is the porch door threshold detail. It's it's drawing number 3 on sheet A5. And so that is linked. So if I go back to my sheet of details and I renumber that detail, like it becomes detail number 4, becomes detail number 15, because the detail callout marker is linked to that viewport, this will automatically renumber. So it makes drawing coordination really kind of nice. So the basic idea, of course, in terms of the project organization is that the model lives in, the model has multiple layers with the different components of the building. Those are design layers, right? And then we do all of our presentation drawings on sheet layers. I think this should be all fairly straightforward. You know, I think we're all pretty much used to working that way. So, so let me go over to my viewports of detail. So here's my sheet of details. Command 4. And it's got my title block, right? And it's got a bunch of details. Now, each of these details is its own viewport, right? You can see there it is. If I click on it, it's a viewport, right? And if I double click on it and I use the viewport to navigate back to the design layer that it's drawn from, you can see that I have a sheet of details. And I've put the details sort of wherever I want, right? And so I have all of these details on this sheet. In fact, Command 6, you can see all the details that I have, right? But each of these details gets its own viewport onto this, from the design layer onto the sheet layer. Why? Why wouldn't I just make one viewport, lay out all my details on a single sheet, as it were, on a design layer, and then just go ahead and do one viewport? And why would I bother with having all of these? Well, for the very same reason that I just showed you a few moments ago, that by virtue of each of these details having its own viewport, I can now dynamically link these details to where they occur on this wall section, or on a building elevation, or a building section, or an interior elevation, right? You can imagine that a window jamb detail might be keyed in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 12 different drawings. And if I have to last minute add another detail and reorganize my sheet to then go through and make sure that everything's well coordinated, could be a real problem. Not only is it time consuming, but I'm prone to making mistakes, and by avoiding this, by not having this automatic drawing coordination. So that's why, even though my details are all drawn on a single layer, right? There they are, you know, they're just two-dimensional drawings. I go ahead and I make a distinct viewport for each of these details that then gets composed on a sheet layer. Here it is, with my details. Now, obviously, for purposes of this presentation, I've sort of culled this file down and just made it a little more manageable, but you get the idea. So then the question is, well, how do I actually draw these details? So this is something that I'm just going to be perfectly transparent. This is something I've been working on for a while, and it isn't something that we've fully implemented in our office. And so another kind of motivation for my giving this talk today is to sort of help encourage us to kind of move over to it. So what I'm referring to is that each of these components has its own distinct class. So you can see that I've got a menu here of a bunch of different classes. And if I go to my class menu, we can look at what all these classes are. So I've got classes for various components for walls, right? Sheathing, siding, gypboard, and so forth. But in addition, I've created all of these detail classes. I don't know how many there are. It looks like about 20 of them. And I've assigned a line weight to all of these classes. In some cases, they have a fill. And they're all name detail dash something, right? And so I have a detail fastener faint or visible, flashing, glass, right? You can read all that. What that does, by virtue of having all of these classes, is that it allows me to have a highly standardized way of presenting all of that graphic information, right? Like the way we work right now is we have like, it's kind of an analog to very old school drafting. We have like 5 or 6 different pen classes, and each pen class corresponds to a line weight, and that's fine. But then for a project, somebody has to remember, oh, when we draw a chipboard, that's supposed to go in the pen 0.15 class. By doing it in this manner, what that means is that I don't have to remember that. I just have to remember to draw the chipboard in the detail dot gypsum wallboard or GWB class, and all of that. Let me go ahead and edit that class so we can sort of see all the goodness there. There you go. It's got a hatch associated with it. It's got a line weight, right? And this is all 2D, so I haven't bothered giving it any kind of 3-dimensional textures because all these details are intended for is 2D drafting. But now I've got this really nice system where I've taken the trouble to set these things up, and as a result, everything is a consistent line weight and graphic attributes from project to project. And all I need to do is just refer back to these classes, and every once in a while I might need to add a new class or edit it, and that's fine too. One of the tricky parts, maybe there's a, oh, well, I'll probably, there we go. One of the tricky parts of Zoom is that there are all these little Zoom menus that you can't see that are floating everywhere, and I got to move them in order to get out of my other dialog box. So there we go. So you can see that I've drawn this polyline in the detail insulation rigid. I've got this polyline, which represents the lap siding as my detail exterior fiber cement. Here's a polyline. It's the detail wood plywood, right? Then for certain, Vectorworks has some built-in tools. So here's a detail cut wood tool or object, right? For my dimensional lumber. And I'll get to that later. But the basic idea is that I have detailing classes. Now, the other thing that's really key is that I use my constraints, or you can tell I'm kind of old school here. We just call them snaps now, right? So I've got my constraints, my grid snap, my object snap, snap to angles and objects and so forth. So that as I'm drawing, I'm trying to constrain everything and snap to it so that everything is nice and precise. Now, there is an exception that I make in terms of like the accuracy of my drafting, which is when I'm detailing, what I will often do is explode the drawing ever so slightly, which is to say, and I'm sure many of you do the same thing, right? So there's actually, here's I've got a sheathing that includes rigid insulation on top of plywood, and then I've got this very slight little gap. It's 1/8 of an inch or so. You might use the nudge tool, but I just kind of have a habit of moving things in increments of 1/16 of an inch when I'm detailing, so that I can go ahead and draw this membrane between these two layers, and everything's not sort of collapsed all on top of each other, which makes things considerably easier to read, right? So really key are using some sort of a class system, whether you use detail classes per se or your own methodology, but try to use classes and draw everything with certain fixed graphic attributes for consistency. Use your snaps so that everything's nice and tight. And then there are times, particularly for any kind of drawing really, where align distribute gets to be really useful. So let me find an instance of that. So for example, over here at this guardrail detail, maybe I want to have all of these elements be evenly distributed. So I would take these four rectangles and then use align distribute to center them and then distribute their spacing. Well, they're already distributed, but you get the idea. And if I just kind of move these. So the align distribute command, right? If I center these now, they're just going to all center about their geometric center. So it's going to move off kilter, as you can see. So what I would do in this case, what I would do in this case is first start by aligning them left. And then I would align them center. So align distribute, super powerful, very useful. Right? And then another align type tool that is really handy, or command, is under the modify menu, under align, there's align distribute leader lines. Right? And so for example, the way that works, if I have some leaders that are not aligned, I assign that a keyboard shortcut if it doesn't already have one. And then I will go ahead and align my label points, and I may or may not decide to align the shoulder points. And then I just pick a reference point, and now all of those align nicely. Now what it doesn't do is move the arrowheads, and since I move them, then I'm going to have to move them back, but you get the idea. So very nice way of making all of your notes line up very clearly, makes the details very, very easy to read. So I can lay out my details on this grid. I have this sort of system of rectangles in a guide class, which may be faint or turned off. And then I can go ahead and lay all of those out as I wish on my drawing. And so, again, just to make the point, if for some reason I decide that I want to move this drawing over here and renumber it as drawing number 13, right? That's my window jamb detail. So let's there it is, 6A5, right? And so if I go back to that sheet, whoops, there we go. And I renumber that 13, 12, 13. Go to my wall section. Here we go, 13. Let's see. Oh, Guy just chimed in with a question. If I think he sent that to everybody. If you ever use keyed notes instead of writing out notes for each detail, sometimes that's definitely more common for commercial projects than residential projects. So when we tend to do commercial projects, then that's kind of the standard that we use. But for residential projects, we just write them all out explicitly, and then of course we use the notes database and the Keynote Manager to try to ensure consistency. I personally, I prefer having the note right there on the drawing so that somebody doesn't have to go and look up note number 52 in an index somewhere. But obviously for some projects that are quite large, it's just unruly, and you gotta use keynotes. So back to the two-dimensional details themselves. A couple of things that sort of make your life better is one is to use symbols, right? So head jambs and sills are components from window manufacturers, door manufacturers. That's an easy one, right? So you can download those libraries. I tend to trace them and or import them into a blank file, clean them up, assign my classes to them, and then turn them into symbols. I usually use the insertion point is where the nailing pin meets the frame wall for a window, obviously, and then you know, by having that as a symbol and using consistent classes, right? Because that symbol just includes a little bit of glass. I can just extend that glass however I need for that particular detail using the same consistent classes. All right. Okay, so so symbols are really super useful, particularly if you know, I've got something that repeats again and again. So, for example, I've got this symbol over here that I created. You can see how that contextualizes. So it's this typical head detail. It's got a little piece of foam spacer. It's got some cut wood details, some rigid insulation. It's got some moisture barrier, a head flashing detail. That itself is its own custom symbol. And again, you know, symbols can be nested. All of the components are drawn in the appropriate classes and so on and so forth. So symbols make life much, much nicer. And then finally, you've got some baked in Vectorworks detailing plugin objects, right? So here's an example right here, this cut wood object, which you can use. You can either show size or not. You can choose any number of standard sizes, 1 to 14-inch increments in imperial, right? So I could do a 4x6 or whatever. And I can, of course, choose a custom size if I wanted. So if I don't know why I would do this, but make it 3 inches, a 3x6. And I can choose either rough or blocking or finish, right? So much quicker than having a whole series of symbols for all of your 2x materials, right? Just go ahead and use that tool. All right, back to what it was. Then I also have, in addition, let's see, a bad insulation tool, right, which you can use at a variety of scales. So sometimes I've seen people use these in plan to delineate soft goods, for example. And so you can specify the thickness, the width of the bad insulation, how many folds per unit. So if you want to make it 1/2 inch and make it super wavy, or, you know, whatever graphic standards appeal to you, you could do that. So in this case, I'm using the bad insulation tool to show a foam spacer, right? And I can stretch it that way or not. Assign it a class. So that's a great one that you get to use a lot. There is a linear material. Now I've got to find it. There's so that chipboard is drawn as a linear material. Somehow that's hard to say. And I've got a variety of choices that Vectorworks has for me, a generic board or plaster or plywood, right? And there are certain graphics that are associated with that, so I could even do corrugations. So really, this is like multiple tools all in one, well worth exploring. And somehow I changed the thickness along the way, so I'll just undo all that. There we go. And typically I would show that let's see if I can, I don't think I can reverse that. There isn't a reversed line direction, so I'll go ahead and modify and rotate that and flip it vertical so that the paper is on the outside where it belongs. Right, so all of these you're going to find in your detailing palette. So linear material, bat insulation, detail cut wood. Then another great one is my repetitive unit. So here I use that in that first wall section to show you the seams of the standing seam roof. Okay. So that's just a repetitive unit, and I can get some symbols that are baked into Vectorworks, come out of the box. Or in this case, I think I used a local roofing manufacturer and drew one of their snap lock profiles. And so that's the symbol that I use. And so rather than just pasting the symbol and arraying it over and over again, you just have this repetitive unit. So it's great for like doing a run of comp shingle, any number of uses. And you can specify the offset and pitch and rotation. You can flip it, so forth. So these are sort of time-saving tools that you might ignore and just go ahead and draw all this stuff by hand, but there's just this huge library of already made fasteners, steel members, and so forth, all in that detailing panel. So more than we have time to explore today, but well worth going through and getting to know those, because they are big time savers, and most of the tools have a variety of appearances that you can select from. So you could have a screw, for example, that shows all the threading, or it could be more diagrammatic and so forth. So let me go back to this section viewport since I'm here and talk a little bit more about how that's set up. So again, this is a viewport. In the actual work file, that viewport is drawn from the design layer, or I'm sorry, from the sheet layer of a plan, for example, or this might be a detail viewport that is called out from a section. So I might have a building section and then draw a detail viewport. So let me show you the settings on that. So first of all, the layers that contribute to that, right? So pretty much I've got my floor and roof layers. I might also include the site model as part of it, but generally the site model's, you know, pretty large, and my wall section is by definition, you know, rather limited. So I may not include that. But all of these layers are contributing to that, right? And then, oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. And then for classes, I pretty much have anything that I want to see in the model is going to show up as a class within that viewport. So and that's quite logical, I think. If I want to see it, then I need to turn its class on. I can display planar objects and components, the reason I would display planar objects is if I have any 2D geometry that I've drawn on a plane, I might want to see that. So, for example, these ceiling battens are actually just rectangles, right? But I could have drawn those by just drawing rectangles directly onto the underside of the soffit of the roof. And then they would just be 2D rectangles. I'm not bothering to extrude them because I don't necessarily need that level of detail. But then I would go ahead and want to show those as planar objects in my viewport. And then I definitely want to display my 2D components. So I'm going to get to 2D components towards a little bit later in our discussion today, so just kind of hold that thought. And I want to display the extents beyond the cut plane, right? Because obviously I want to see the context of the section, I want to see the screening beyond and so forth. And then for advanced properties, I tend to prefer to let my viewports have an infinite length and height range and use my viewport crop to crop the width and height of the viewport. Simply because sometimes the section line doesn't really correspond to what width I actually want that viewport to have. And then I can limit how deep things are beyond the cut plane, and then objects before the cut plane or sort of behind the viewer in the cut plane might also be shown. In this case, not. For the attributes for section viewports that I'm going to display at a fairly small scale, like 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, something like that, I would merge all the cross sections so that everything just appears as a kind of a generic poché. But in this case, I want to separate the cross sections. I want to use the attributes of the original objects, and I want to merge the structural objects with the same fill. And in fact, I can even add a profile line. So we'll go ahead and do that. And then anything beyond the cut plane, I'm going to let it use its own fill, but I'm going to force it to be in my lighter pen weight so that things beyond are rather light. And then I'll go ahead and update that because I've added that outline. And so you can see that in this case, Vectorworks has anything that is being sectioned, Vectorworks has added this heavy, or this 0.30 millimeter line around it because that's the class that I told it to give. Or I could do that manually. But the reason that I have objects with attributes of the original being shown and structurally merged is so that when I'm looking at this wall section, right, I can see the bat insulation tiling pattern that is assigned to the class that is part of that wall. So let's go ahead and look at that. We'll section it in place. Oh, that was quick. I was waiting on it to. So now I'm sectioning in place. There's the wall that I've selected. You can see it's my wall exterior class and it's my exterior 2x6 insulated siding. That's the name of my wall style. I'm going to go ahead and edit the style here from the object info palette, not because I really want to edit it, but it's an opportunity to show you how it was built. So here we are. I've got siding. That function should actually be outer finish. I've got a proprietary system that is both sheathing and insulation. Now that's okay, a little lazy on my part because this sheathing material is actually two materials. It's the OSB sheathing plus insulation. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new component here. I'll call that my rigid insulation. I might even decide to spell it correctly. The function is going to be, you guessed it, insulation. And then I'm just going to do a search here and look for rigid insulation. So now I've automatically assigned it to that detail class, or I could actually probably show it in my, oh, I don't have a, yep, that's the only insulation class I have. It'll be a 1/2 inch. I could, if I was building an Energos model, I would go ahead and look up its lambda here, which is its resistance to thermal conductance. Again, I can filter. So here we go. Rigid, I think that's a polystyrene, not a polyurethane, right? And the component top and so forth can be relative to the wall. Make all the attributes by class. That's kind of the point, right? So there we go. So here's my rigid insulation. And in fact, I can rename that and call it part of my zip system. And then I can edit the sheathing. Right. And that's going to be structural. That's also 1/2 inch. So I've just taken this 1 inch component and broken it up into 2 1/2 inch components, which is more accurate. That's going to be load bearing, and this will be my inner finish. There we go. So because I changed that wall style, I'm going to go ahead and align the studs center to center, leave all the heights the way they are. And here we go. It'll probably take a moment to recalculate. This will be an opportunity to have coffee. And there we go. You can see that in that wall, it's now taken what was just a 1 inch component and broken it up into 2 1/2 inch components. If I go back to my viewport, now we've got that rigid insulation here. So here, that rigid insulation is maybe looking a little too, like the spacing needs to be a little tighter. It's a grid. So I can go back to my classes and find my detail insulation rigid class, edit that. And I could perhaps assign a tighter grid hatch to it in order for that to appear appropriately. I don't know if I have one handy. Or under my advanced properties, I could might be able to scale that. Oh, I've got some chat windows. Oh, yeah, I'll get to those later. All right. So, so I might have a couple of options for making that hatch a little tighter. One would be to go ahead and if I just go to my hatches for this file, I might take that rigid insulation and duplicate that hatch and then scale it, right? And then I could assign that, override that class in that one specific viewport. So the same holds true for roof styles and for floor slabs, right? All of these styles can be tailored to display correctly in your wall section, and that starts to make these wall sections function far more credibly as a vehicle for communicating more detailed information. Then to control, once I've modeled all of this with my wall styles and geometry and BIM tools and so forth, then of course, as I showed you before, I might annotate that. So I might have this polygon. Here's a polygon that I've just given a fill to. If I could find my resource or my attributes palette. Somehow fell asleep. Wake up attributes palette. So here I've just assigned it a black fill and then set the fill opacity to 20%. And the reason that I'm using a black fill at 20% rather than a gray fill is that if I'm printing in black and white, so here I went over to my black and white mode, right? Then these will still appear as a gray tone, whereas if I just assign it a gray color, of course in black and white mode, that will just appear as white. So, because any color except black in black and white mode for fills shows up as white. So rather than do a light gray, I'm just going to take black and then dial the opacity down. And so that helps give me a little bit of poche action in that viewport. And that's nice. And then of course, all of these notes, all of these callouts refer back to a database so that if I change that node in one place, then it gets changed throughout as I manage that database. Then because I'm not using my line instance, the section line instance, to define the length of that viewport, of course, like any viewport, or not any, but like many viewports, it has a crop. So if we go into the crop, you can see that in fact, there's a whole model over here that I have gone ahead and that's all being generated from the model, but I'm just cropping this one area just with a simple rectangular crop. So let's see, I know there were a couple of questions. Somebody was asking where all these tools live. So again, there's a detailing menu over here, or palette. And of course, depending on your workspace, but it looks like, a little wide flange and perspective. And that's where all of these tools live. And then somebody was asking me, maybe I think somebody saw a curved truss and a straight truss. So I'm using a variety of Vectorworks, which is Vectorworks Designer. So it includes landscape and architect and spotlight. And I think those trusses are spotlight trusses. They're not, try to get the architects really excited. These are lighting trusses, not structural building trusses. I mean, obviously they're structural and they go in buildings, but they're lighting trusses. So that's why you're seeing this straight truss and the curved truss and the soft goods, things that may not look familiar to you if you're just using architect. So once I've set up my viewport by sectioning my model and I've cropped it, I've defined which classes that viewport is going to display and how it's going to display it, then I can annotate it with my notes and my keys, and I'm pretty much off to the races. Now there's a couple of other features that I want to talk about before we conclude today that are sort of detail specific. If you've been paying close attention, you can see that my door, the section here through this door head is, you know, it's very, very abstract. But what's going on with this window where there seems to be a fair amount of detail going on? Well, there's a couple of ways of addressing that. If I wanted my window sections and door sections to be more heavily detailed, of course, one thing I could do is I could simply paste or insert a symbol that had all of this detailed information within the annotations for that viewport. And I mean, that's effective, but then you would have to keep track of all those things. So instead, what's going on is that this window has some two-dimensional components that are assigned to it. So what does that mean? How does that work? So let's go over to the design layer from this viewport. I'll go to top plan view. So here's the window in question. Now, I confess that it's been long enough since I've looked at this file that I've lost track of where I got that detail. So section place, that's what I want to do. All right. Well, now I'm trying to remember how I did this. That's always amusing. So there's a component to this window, and I'm trying to recall how I derived that. Maybe someone's going to give me a clue. Nope. All right. Well, the chat window isn't going to save me. So that's okay. We can do another example, and we can sort that out. So let's use a piece of plumbing as an example. I think that'll work just fine, even if it's not the window in question. So let's go over to plumbing. It's a good example. All right. So in more recent versions of Vectorworks, when I have a symbol, I'll use this chroma. In old versions, when I was editing a symbol, I had either a 3D model of the symbol, or I would have a 2D top plan view. So here you're seeing a 2D top plan of that view of that symbol. Let me go back to a design layer where we're not starting at 1-to-1, and that might be a little bit easier. There we go. All right, so if I edit this 2D component of the symbol, right? I'm in top plan view, it's a group, it's got some lines, polygons, whatever. And you can see that when I'm editing that symbol's 2D components, that I am getting this little floating component edit palette. And by default, it's going to start me out in top plan view. But I can also start creating two-dimensional drawings that represent certain three-dimensional views. So the bottom view, the front, the back, left, right. So let's go ahead and go to the right view. And under the right view, you can see right now there's nothing there, right? But one of the things that I can do is I can show the 3D, so that gives me some context, right? So here's that 3D view sort of grayed out of this component. And so I could just use that as a guide in order to make a two-dimensional drawing of that side view so that I would be able to substitute that 2D drawing whenever I had an exact side view of this symbol. So in this case, an easier thing than drawing over all of this is there's a contextual menu that helps me out. If I right-click when I'm inside the 2D component of a symbol, this generate 2D from 3D component command pops up. And it allows me to create a dashed or a wireframe or a hidden line rendering of that 3D geometry. And so there it is. Right. And I can go in and change the line weight to all of this, assign it to my classes and so forth. And so now whenever I have a three-dimensional view of that object, I just see the 3D object as you would expect, right? Or a hidden line view, for example. But if I take the right view of that object, it's going to swap out this two-dimensional information for the 3D model. And that can be a time saver for some very complex geometry. But in the case of my window example, I can overlay this more detailed drawing information. So back to my wall section. So that that window has this two-dimensional information, which has been specified to show whenever I am in that window. So let's look at the settings. And for, I think it's under 3D visualization. And so, well, I'm going to have to find that. And you can see that I've got this low, medium, and high level of detail, right, for my top plan view. But for my, say my, no, that's not where I got it. I am really stuck here. All right, well, I'm gonna have to get back to this another time. I'm sorry. Oops, clicked the wrong button again. Bill is asking about sectioning in place. So when I have a section viewport, I have the option to annotate the viewport or crop it, or I can go back to the design layer. But there's a section in place option that was added in Vectorworks in the last few versions. And by sectioning in place, that takes me back to the design layer or design layers. And it is literally showing me a section in place in 3 dimensions, almost like a clip cube view. And I can do some direct editing. So for example, this is a parametric door. So even from within this section in place, I could change it from a 3080 to a 3068, right? And then when I go back to my viewport, it will go ahead and make that change because I'm making that change everywhere throughout the model. So it's a different way of accessing the model directly from the section viewport, so that in essence, I'm almost direct modeling in the section viewport. And you can see that that door, you know, dropped down from an 80 to a 68. So I'm going to have to move my marker, but the geometry has been updated. So that's what section in place is. So the advantage of having this 2-dimensional content to some of your symbols is that you can go ahead and show greater detail within your section viewports because you're swapping out more detailed information for the sort of coarser geometry. Now, in most cases, it's just fine to have just a simple plug-in geometry here and then key in a detail back to the sheet of details that you've gone ahead and drawn, as I have over here. I'm going to open it up to any additional questions. If I can figure out how to unmute everybody so that I don't have to go back, and I'll go ahead and unmute everyone. And please, if you have some questions, speak up.
Let's see. I have a question. So you have in your design layer, you have a sheet of detail of just all sorts of details which you use throughout the project. Can you reference that same sheet for another project that you're doing that has the same detail? Or do you have to copy that detail into the next project?
Yeah, absolutely reference them. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll have a sheet of details just as an entirely separate file.
Right.
And then that can be referenced back using design layer referencing. So essentially that detail design layer is referenced from the detail file onto the project file, from one design layer to the next. And then from that reference design layer, there are viewport references onto the sheet of details, just like I'm showing you here.
Right. Okay.
So there's just that one extra step of, instead of drawing the details natively on a design layer, you're drawing them on a separate file and referencing that in. And there's 2 benefits to that. One is it makes it a lot easier for 2 people to be working on the same project at the same time. It's sort of an alternative to project sharing, instead of instead of taking a file and sort of slicing off a layer and handing it off to somebody, it's just a slightly different paradigm where there's a separate file that's referenced in. So it allows us to sort of gang up on a project a little more easily, because generally when somebody's, you know, that's a very natural way to break up the work. Like, you know, someone might be working on details for a couple of days.
But
yep.
when you have this, what I'll call them your sheet of standard details, which is its own file outside of all your specific projects, and each project or any project can refer back to any detail in the standard details. So let's just say, for example, that you're reviewing your standard details, which you put together a few years ago, and oh, that window is no longer manufactured. We got to switch out this standard detail to this. Does that automatically change all the other projects you've ever done? Or once you've imported that detail into a project, it stays in the condition that it was at that time? In other words, if you change a standard detail, will that change all the references that you've made to it in the past?
Well, I have two things to say about that, at least, maybe more. One is, I don't think that's a good practice to have a sheet of standard details that you use over and over again. I mean, it sounds nice in theory, and maybe it's just because I do a lot of residential architecture, which you're always kind of tinkering. And, you know, obviously there are some things that will get standardized and reused. But what I've found is that when I think that I have a standard detail that I can use over and over again, there's always a little something in one project or another that I've got to tweak it. And so it doesn't really work to have standard, personally in my practice, to have like standard details that just get used again and again. There are very similar details that get used multiple times, but I don't know, somehow we just feel the need to have to reinvent the wheel every time. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that realistically speaking, of course, again, everybody's different. Like, some people will hang on to Vectorworks for 5 versions and won't update, but we're updating Vectorworks every year. And so that sheet of details is, if it's 5 versions old and it's being referenced in a project that's 4 years old, no, changing the detail isn't going to change updating the detail isn't going to retroactively update old projects, because that old project is referring to an old Vectorworks file that isn't being updated. And then finally, I always set up my viewports that they only refresh when I manually refresh them. I never set up viewports to automatically refresh. And it's precisely to avoid that kind of condition with detail libraries.
All right, so then I think I understand better. So the practice might be that, let's say I do happen to keep a sheet of standard details. What I would do is, for project, 2020, whatever I'm working on, whatever details that I need from that, I could copy that detail into my new project, into some sheet, and then use that, any tinkering I need to do to it for that project, and just use my copy in my new project.
I think realistically, I think realistically that's how actually it works.
All right, that makes sense. It's safer.
It's safer, and anyway, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
When you were referring to the attempting to look at those Windows sections,
yes,
is there a way to set that detail up so that you have within the I guess you'd be but set it up so that you could do a low detail, medium, and high detail within the section itself, within the detail itself, with overlays that are in, and just turn them on and off, essentially.
Yeah, I'm glad that Neil's here, because Neil, I don't know if you might have stepped away, But I set up that live section, and I had set up this window with some 2D detail components, only because this file is like a couple of years old or a year old. I can't remember how I did it. Can you, I don't know if I need to, I'll unmute you if you can bail me out.
For sure, yeah. No, I did just have to take a call when you were doing that, but I think I
Sure.
caught the end of it. Were you looking for the place to edit what is seen for that particular item?
Yep.
Yeah.
When it's a plugin, when it's a symbol, I know how to do that. When it's a plugin object, I just forgot.
For sure, for sure. Well, try right-clicking on the object itself and keep going down, edit 2D components.
There we go. Okay.
And it'll give you some messages about this and that. And then when you get in here, you might not see it. So just do a Command 6 or a fit to objects and it should find it.
Yeah, there we go. So there's the top and bottom cut, and here's the left and right section cut. So there we go. Thanks, Neil.
Yep, you're welcome.
Yeah, so
it's a handy one that I'm still getting used to myself.
So you can see that I've got this buried, that in fact, the answer to your question is yes. You can see that over here, I've drawn some really basic geometry for the window profile that is more like this. I don't know if this is a Marvin or a Milgard or what this is, right? And you can see that in the 2D objects, it's visible at medium and high, but at low, it won't be visible. And so what does that mean? That means that at low levels of detail in a viewport, I'll just see the geometry of the plugin object itself instead of what I've drawn, right? But then all of this stuff is only visible at high levels of detail.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, yeah.
Yep, and then if I exit the plugin object and go back to the viewport, right, you can see that the viewport detail level as a whole is either low, medium, or high. So if I change it to low, and I'll probably need to refresh it at that point.
Whoops.
It's gone altogether. Well, I've broken it. Right? Probably by not having any geometry, by putting in some geometry. I need to include like a low profile that's just the whole thing, right? It doesn't default to the.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Now, I will say this, that for Windows in particular, this is, I mean, I chose to do this as an example in this instance. Windows in particular are a bit problematic because, you know, you might have windows of 6 different heights in a project. Like you have a 4-foot tall window and a 2-foot tall window and a 3-foot tall window. And because of that, you're going to have to draw an instance, right? The window head might be the same in every position, but the sill component is going to be in a different location. And so now you may have to have symbols for each of your window types, as opposed to just parametrically changing your window on the fly, so that you've got a symbol for a 2-foot window, a symbol for a 3-foot window, and so forth. Doors, where you tend to have fewer options, like they tend to be, at least in my world, they're either 6/8 or 8 feet, maybe 7 feet, right? That's a little bit more tractable. But that feature is there if it's appropriate to you. And again, it's like I oftentimes find myself saying, you know, like in a lot of these discussions about Vectorworks, like, you know, different tools are appropriate for different applications and for different users depending on what your particular needs are. But yes, in general, yeah, you right click on the object. Thanks for bailing me out there, Neil. You right click on the object in order to be able to edit what 2D geometry you swap out for the top view or the right view or whatever. Vectorworks automatically generates, for plugin windows and doors, automatically generates that top view for you. But so, for example, I know an architect friend of mine. We would have these long, pointless discussions about this. For his reflected ceiling plans, he did not want to see a window. Like, he just wanted to see the wall, right? And I like to see the window, and we can get into that over beers or coffee or whatever at some point. But again, and so this, at the time, he would have to go in, like, this was years ago, he would have to go in and manually mask all of his doors and windows on his reflected ceiling plans. And it was important to him, and so he did that. But now he could just swap out some 2D geometry that essentially hid all of the window information directly from the plugin object, and so he would never have to do that again. So anyway, and yes, and then and there's low, medium, and high, and then those settings are set on a viewport by viewport basis. So if for some reason you need to mix low and high detail within the same viewport, then you're better off just sort of annotating that in the annotation space, and because of course you can draw in the annotation space, and there you go.
Yeah.
So I have a question basically about generalizing all this. So this little detailed window section that maybe drew down from the manufacturer, you use that in the blow up detail of your viewport. That's where it was placed. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is that beautiful section detail, is that actually tied in three-dimensional space to the window?
No.
It's not.
No, this detail over here, if I understand your question correctly, Bill, oh, come on. There we go. This detail over here,
yeah,
that's its own beast. And I could delete every window in the project and that detail would still be there. It is just a two-dimensional drawing that is just independent. It's its own thing, right? And so it's not linked to the three-dimensional model.
But when you do the section in place in your viewport section, that drawing, that section detail miraculously appeared in isometric on the section in place. And I think that's what I was curious about.
Yeah. And so what is true, the way they are linked, is that I have a symbol here of this Milgard. I guess I can now endorse Milgard because they're no longer available in Texas as of like 3 weeks ago. So,
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
But anyway, so yeah, I've got this symbol and I've inserted it here. And then if we go back to the section in place, there we go. Aren't safe views just the bomb diggity?
Oh, right. It becomes part of the section of the model.
Yeah, so now if I right click on this and edit the 2D components, and go to the left and right section, select all 6, right? Right, so no, I didn't, for some reason I didn't symbolize that, I exploded it.
All right.
Not sure why I did that. Maybe 2D components don't like symbols.
Then there's no way to tag that detailed drawing to the head of that window, let's say in the window schedule, so that whenever you do a section through any window of that same type, that magical little detail drawing would appear. that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It totally does. If I do a section of any window, this little detail is going to appear, so long as it's this plugin object.
Right.
And this is what I was saying earlier. That's problematic. That's fine for the window head because the window head is always at the head of the window.
Right.
But it's problematic down here at the sill because I had to make a choice to put this sill profile at this location within the space of the section. But what if I have the same plugin object and I use that same plugin window style, right, for a 2-foot tall window versus a 4-foot tall window? I'm gonna have this weird sill thing, you know, in the wrong place on one of those windows.
Well, that's what
so
I was saying. If, in other words, you can't tag your little sill detail saying, okay, this is a sill detail for this window type, and whenever that window type appears, whether it's 2 feet high, 3 feet high, or whatever, it will always show up attached to the sill, no matter how high the window is.
There may have been some improvements made like just recently, but my understanding is no. When I'm sort of drawing a section component, I mean, I'm really curious about why I didn't use a symbol here. It's like, because it is obviously the exact same profile that I can't seem to place in the right place. There we go. Send that to back and put that only at high detail. But yeah, it's not perfect.
Right.
And but I would still make the case again that having this level of detail in a 1/2 inch scale or a 3/4 inch scale wall section is actually super useful. And then go ahead and use symbols and sort of, you know, BIM disassociated details at 3 inches or 2 inches, and then you know, that there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you know,
it's no big deal to
I'm a BIM guy. I've written 2 books about it.
Right.
You know, but like, let's not be, you know, so dogmatic that we feel that every single thing that shows up in the drawing has to be, you know, some IFC model, right? It's like that's not the intent here.
Right. And since it's a symbol, it's no big deal to place that symbol in any situation where that window still occurs. It's not a huge amount of work to do that. So
exactly.
I have a symbol.
Yeah.
And then right now I'm going through an exercise on a project where we're, you know, for cost reasons, surprise, surprise, we're changing window manufacturers. I think we've all been there, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, while we have just a moment, I think I ought to introduce myself. I found out this past Monday, was it? Whatever. That user group Zooms are listed in Vectorworks calendar, and so this is my first my first visit to another user group. I'm the chair of the St. Louis user group, and so I figured I'd come and take a visit and see how other groups are doing things, and maybe I can learn something. I figure that's anytime I learn something, that's a plus. So, at any rate, that's my background. I've been working with Vectorworks for, well, since it was Minicad 3, actually. But I'm still, as far as I'm concerned, a novice. I learn something every day. So, anyway, I appreciate you guys being here. Let me tell you that. So.
Well, Barry, thanks for joining us. That is kind of, that is kind of cool that we can have people from different different parts of the country or the world drop in on our user group meeting. And I think they're also, if I'm not mistaken, the user group meetings are also coming up on your Vectorworks alerts in the wherever alerts sit now. I currently don't have any, but Vectorworks has that little bell alert symbol. I think it got moved to the lower right corner or something like that. But anyway, so yeah, glad to have you here. And
it's an interesting meeting. So
well, good.
So, Barry, you said that there's the main Vectorworks user group site has a list of all the Zoom meetings around the country, or
it's in the Vectorworks calendar. Hang on here a second.
Yeah. I get it. I guess the Zoom thing is becoming relatively new.
Oh yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to look. Good to know. We're all getting very tired of listening to Francois, so we thought we'd try something else. Just kidding.
Oh, no, please do. All right, everybody. Well, thanks very much. And Neil, thanks again for bailing me out, and really appreciate everybody's patience with my blundering through this. And hopefully it was productive. And we'll have to figure out what to talk about next month. But we got a few weeks to do that.
You can edit those portions out on your recording, right?
Yeah. I remember doing a podcast once where I said I used those very words. You can edit that out, right? And I heard that later in the podcast. So they chose not to edit that.
Oh well.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much. All right. Bye-bye. Be well. Bye, Neil.